The ER doctors refused to treat my daughter's allergic reaction. Then they saw my hospital ID badge. My daughter Zara's lips started swelling during dinner at the new Italian restaurant downtown, her 9-year-old face transforming from excited to terrified in the span of seconds. I watched her fork clatter against the plate as she touched her mouth with trembling fingers, her eyes going wide with the recognition that something was very wrong. The hives appeared next, angry red welts spreading across her neck and chest like wildfire. She'd been allergic to shellfish since she was 3, and I'd specifically asked the waiter 3 times if there was any seafood in the marinara sauce. He'd assured me it was completely vegetarian, his confident smile never wavering as he recited the ingredients. I grabbed my phone and EpiPen from my purse simultaneously, the familiar weight of the auto-injector grounding me even as panic tried to claw its way up my throat. Zara's breathing had started to sound tight, a subtle wheeze that I recognized immediately as the beginning of anaphylaxis. I'd been a pediatric emergency physician at Riverside General Hospital for 11 years, and I'd treated hundreds of allergic reactions. But medical knowledge becomes paralyzingly abstract when your own child is the patient, when every textbook symptom you've memorized is manifesting in the face you kiss goodnight every evening. I jammed the EpiPen into her outer thigh through her jeans, counting the required seconds while other diners turned to stare. The epinephrine bought us time, but wasn't a cure, just a temporary break on her body's cascading immune response. We needed a hospital immediately for monitoring and additional treatment. Riverside General was my hospital, where I'd worked every shift for over a decade, but it was 23 minutes away in Friday evening traffic. Mercy Point Hospital was 7 minutes away, a smaller facility I'd never visited, but knew had a full emergency department. Basic math and basic medicine made the choice obvious. I threw cash on the table without counting it, scooped Zara into my arms despite her being too big to carry comfortably anymore, and ran for my car while calling out to the manager that there was shellfish in their supposedly vegetarian sauce. Zara's breathing worsened during the drive, each inhale a labored struggle that made my hands shake on the steering wheel. I talked to her constantly, using my calm doctor voice while my actual emotional state was somewhere between terror and rage. She kept trying to respond but couldn't get enough air for full sentences, just fragments that broke my heart. "Mom, I can't," she'd start, then have to stop to gasp. I promised her we were almost there, that the doctors would fix this, that she was going to be fine. The lies came easily because the alternative was unthinkable. I ran 2 red lights getting to Mercy Point, my hazards flashing and horn blaring, praying no cops would slow us down. The emergency entrance was well lit and clearly marked, and I screeched into a spot reserved for ambulances because walking from the parking lot was time we didn't have. I carried Zara through the automatic doors, her weight heavy in my arms, her breathing now a terrifying whistle that meant her airway was closing. The waiting room was half full, people with various non-emergent complaints looking up with curiosity and concern as I rushed past them. I went straight to the triage desk where a nurse in purple scrubs sat typing into a computer, her name tag reading, Donna Murphy, RN. I didn't wait for her to acknowledge me before speaking, my voice loud and urgent. "My daughter is in anaphylaxis. She needs epinephrine and airway management immediately." Donna looked up slowly, her expression shifting from mild irritation at being interrupted to assessment of the situation. She stood and came around the desk, but instead of the immediate action I expected, she reached for a clipboard. "I'm going to need you to fill out some paperwork first. Insurance information, medical history, consent forms." Her tone was bureaucratic, rehearsed, the voice of someone following protocol without thinking about what those protocols meant. I stared at her in disbelief, my arms burning from Zara's weight, my daughter's wheezing growing louder. "She's in anaphylactic shock. Look at her. She needs treatment right now, not in 10 minutes after I've filled out forms." Donna's expression remained neutral, almost bored. "Hospital policy requires registration before treatment, except in cases of obvious life-threatening emergency. She doesn't look that bad to me. She's talking. She's conscious. Fill out the forms and we'll get her seen as soon as possible." The words hit me like a slap. Doesn't look that bad. I was holding my daughter who was actively suffocating from an allergic reaction, whose airway could close completely at any moment. And this nurse was telling me she didn't look that bad. I felt something snap inside me, the professional composure I'd maintained shattering under the weight of maternal desperation. "If you don't get a doctor right now, my daughter could die. This is a medical emergency." A security guard appeared from somewhere to my left, a heavy-set man whose hand rested on his belt in a casually threatening posture. "Ma'am, you need to calm down. We have procedures here. If you can't follow them, I'll have to ask you to leave." The absurdity of it, the Kafkaesque nightmare of being threatened with removal from a hospital while my child couldn't breathe, sent me past fear into a kind of cold fury. "I'm not going anywhere without treatment for my daughter. Get me a doctor now, or I'm going to start screaming until someone with actual medical judgment comes out here." The security guard took a step closer, and I felt the situation spiraling out of control in ways I couldn't have imagined. Donna picked up a phone and said something I couldn't hear, then turned back to me with an expression that suggested I was the problem, not the hospital's insane priorities. "Dr. Vance will be out in a moment, but you need to understand that making threats and causing disruptions won't get your daughter seen any faster. In fact, it might get you both removed from the premises." She said this while Zara's breathing deteriorated in my arms, while my daughter's lips turned a darker shade of purple blue, while every second of delay increased the risk of permanent brain damage or death. I wanted to throw the clipboard at Donna's head, wanted to scream obscenities until my voice gave out, but I forced myself to stay focused on what mattered. "Please," I said through clenched teeth, "just help her." Dr. Vance emerged from the treatment area wearing scrubs and an expression of profound annoyance at being bothered. He was in his 40s with graying temples and the kind of face that suggested he'd stopped caring about his patients years ago. He didn't approach us, just stood 10 feet away with his arms crossed. "What seems to be the problem?" His tone implied that whatever I was about to say would be an exaggeration, that I was wasting his valuable time. Zara's breathing had become so labored that she was using her neck muscles to pull in air, a sign that terrified me because it meant she was mere minutes from complete respiratory arrest. "My daughter ate shellfish accidentally. She's allergic. She's in anaphylaxis and needs immediate treatment." Dr. Vance looked at Zara with what I can only describe as skeptical disinterest. "Did you give her anything?" I told him about the EpiPen 15 minutes ago, about her worsening symptoms, about the obvious signs of severe allergic reaction that any first-year medical student should recognize. He sighed like I'd just recounted a boring story about my grocery shopping. "Look, kids get hives all the time. It's probably not as serious as you think. We'll get her into a room eventually, but we have critical patients ahead of her. Real emergencies. Take a seat and wait your turn." He started to turn away, and something inside me ignited with a rage I'd never experienced before. "I don't think you understand. My daughter is dying. Right now. In front of you. If you walk away without treating her, you're committing medical malpractice and possibly negligent homicide." I used my physician voice, the one that made medical students stand up straighter and residents double-check their work. But Dr. Vance just laughed, actually laughed, and shook his head. "Are you a doctor? Because you sound like someone who's watched too much Grey's Anatomy. I'll be the judge of what constitutes an emergency in my department. Now sit down and wait like everyone else, or I'll have security escort you out." The security guard shifted his weight, ready to follow through on the threat. Zara made a sound then that I'll never forget. A desperate, gasping struggle that meant her airway was closing fast. Her fingernails dug into my arm, and her eyes locked onto mine with pure terror. "Mom." Just that one word, barely audible, carrying a universe of trust that I was going to fix this, that I wouldn't let her die. I made a decision in that moment that was either going to save my daughter or get us both thrown out of the hospital. I shifted her weight to one arm and pulled my wallet out with my free hand, yanking out my Riverside General Hospital ID badge that I'd forgotten to remove after my shift yesterday. I held it up so Dr. Vance and Donna could see it clearly, the photo and my credentials visible under the fluorescent lights. "My name is Dr. Amara Okafor. I'm a pediatric emergency physician at Riverside General with 11 years of experience. I have personally treated over 300 cases of anaphylaxis. My daughter is presenting with classic symptoms of severe allergic reaction, including urticaria, angioedema, respiratory distress, and probable hypotension. She received 0.3 milligrams of epinephrine intramuscularly approximately 18 minutes ago. She now requires immediate administration of additional epinephrine, intravenous fluids, oxygen, cardiac monitoring, and likely intubation if her airway continues to compromise. If you continue to delay treatment, I will personally ensure that every medical board in the state knows your name." The words came out cold and precise, stripped of maternal panic, pure medical authority. The effect was immediate and nauseating. Dr. Vance's face transformed from dismissive contempt to something resembling respect mixed with alarm. His body language shifted, his arms uncrossing, his posture straightening. "Oh, you're a physician. Why didn't you say so earlier?" His tone had completely changed, becoming professional and concerned, as if Zara's symptoms had suddenly become legitimate now that he knew her mother was a colleague. Donna scrambled for a wheelchair, suddenly moving with the urgency that should have been there from the beginning. The security guard stepped back, no longer a threat, and I stood there holding my suffocating daughter, understanding with sickening clarity that they weren't helping her because she needed help. They were helping her because I had the right credentials. They rushed us into a treatment room, and suddenly there were hands everywhere, medical professionals appearing from nowhere to do the jobs they should have been doing 10 minutes ago. Zara was transferred to a gurney. Oxygen mask applied. IV line started with practiced efficiency. A nurse I hadn't seen before administered another dose of epinephrine and hung a bag of fluids. Dr. Vance stood at the head of the bed calling out orders, performing the careful assessment he should have done the moment we walked in. I watched the monitor as Zara's oxygen saturation climbed from a terrifying 87% back toward normal range. Her breathing began to ease as the medication kicked in, the awful whistling sound fading. I held her hand and whispered that she was safe now, trying to ignore the voice in my head screaming about what almost happened. Dr. Vance wouldn't meet my eyes as he worked, and I recognized the body language of someone who knew they'd made a catastrophic error. After 20 minutes of monitoring and treatment, once Zara had stabilized enough that the immediate crisis had passed, he pulled me aside. His voice was quiet, almost pleading. "Look, I apologize for the delay. We've been incredibly busy tonight, and I didn't realize the severity of her condition. These things happen in emergency medicine. You understand, being in the field yourself. It was a poorly disguised attempt to appeal to colleague solidarity, to frame his negligence as an understandable mistake that any doctor might make. But I'd been doing this long enough to know the difference between a reasonable judgment call and dangerous incompetence. I didn't understand anything except that he'd nearly killed my daughter because she hadn't looked sick enough to warrant his immediate attention, and because her mother hadn't initially presented credentials that made her worthy of basic human decency. The fact that showing my hospital badge had instantly transformed their response from callous indifference to urgent care revealed something rotten at the core of this institution. I told Dr. Vance we'd be talking more later, that right now I needed to focus on Zara, but that he should expect to hear from me through official channels. His face paled and he nodded quickly before returning to his other patients, probably already planning his defensive documentation. Zara stayed in the ER for 4 hours under observation, the standard protocol for anaphylaxis to ensure she didn't have a secondary reaction. I sat beside her gurney the entire time, holding her hand, watching the monitors, mentally cataloging every systemic failure that had nearly cost her life. She dozed on and off, the trauma and medication leaving her exhausted. During her sleeping periods, I pulled out my phone and started documenting everything in meticulous detail. Times, names, exact quotes as best I could remember them, the sequence of events from our arrival to the moment I'd shown my badge. I knew from years in medicine that the hospital would start their own documentation, shaping the narrative to protect themselves. I needed my version recorded while the memory was fresh and unfiltered. A different nurse came in around midnight, younger than Donna, with kind eyes and a gentle manner with Zara. Her name tag read, Sophie Laurent, RN, and she checked Zara's vitals while making small talk about a stuffed animal someone had brought in. After she'd finished charting, she lingered by the door as if wanting to say something. Finally, she spoke quietly so Zara wouldn't hear. I was here when you came in. I heard what Donna and Dr. Vance said to you. I wanted to help, but I'm new here and I didn't think they'd listen to me. I'm really sorry. Her guilt was obvious and genuine, but it only highlighted how many people had witnessed this disaster without intervening. I thanked Sophie for her honesty and asked if she'd be willing to provide a statement about what she'd observed. She hesitated, fear flashing across her face. I could lose my job. This hospital, they protect their own and punish anyone who makes waves. But she gave me her personal email anyway, written on a torn piece of paper, and said if I really needed her testimony, she'd consider it. After she left, I sat in the quiet room listening to Zara's steady breathing and the beep of the heart monitor, feeling the weight of what came next. I could file a complaint through official channels that would likely be buried or minimized, or I could do something that would make it impossible for them to ignore what had happened here tonight. By the time they discharged Zara at 3 a.m. with prescriptions for prednisone and additional EpiPens, I'd made my decision. I drove her home through empty streets, carried her to bed, and spent the rest of the night at my kitchen table writing. Not just a complaint letter, but a detailed incident report documenting every failure in her care, analyzed through the lens of my medical expertise. I wrote about the systematic barriers they'd erected between my daughter and treatment, the protocol that valued paperwork over life-threatening emergencies, the security guard threatening to remove a patient in respiratory distress, the doctor who dismissed obvious anaphylaxis until he learned the mother was a colleague. I wrote about implicit bias and how it killed people every day in emergency departments across the country. I sent the report to the hospital's patient relations department, the chief medical officer, and the emergency department director at 6 a.m. Then I sent copies to the state medical board, the joint commission that accredits hospitals, and the Department of Health. I wasn't naive enough to think those institutions would act swiftly or decisively, but I wanted the paper trail established before Mercy Point could start their damage control. Then I did something I'd never considered doing before. I posted a detailed account of what happened on social media, careful to focus on the facts and my medical analysis rather than emotional appeals. I included photos of Zara's hives, her discharge papers showing the severity of her reaction, and my own credentials to establish that I wasn't an hysterical mother who'd overreacted to a minor issue. The response was explosive. Within 6 hours, my post had been shared 3,000 times. Within 12 hours, local news outlets were calling asking for interviews. Other people started commenting with their own stories of being mistreated at Mercy Point Hospital, creating a thread of systemic failure that suggested this wasn't an isolated incident. A woman described bringing her elderly father with chest pain and being made to wait 2 hours while staff chatted about their weekend plans. A man recounted his wife being turned away with appendicitis because they'd assumed she was drug-seeking. Each story followed the same pattern. Patients triaged based on the staff's subjective assessment of worthiness rather than medical need. I'd uncovered something much larger than one doctor's bad judgment. Mercy Point Hospital's PR team released a statement the next day, the carefully worded kind that acknowledged my concerns while admitting nothing. They took patient care very seriously, they claimed, and were conducting a thorough internal review of the incident. They couldn't discuss specific cases due to privacy laws, but assured the public that they maintained the highest standards of emergency medicine. The statement was a masterclass in meaningless corporate speak, designed to sound reassuring while accepting zero accountability. But the internet wasn't buying it. The hospital's social media pages were flooded with comments from people sharing their own negative experiences, asking how many patients had to nearly die before real changes were implemented. Dr. Vance called my cell phone 3 days after the incident, a number he'd obtained from my medical license registration. His voice was tight with barely controlled anger disguised as professional concern. Dr. Okafor, I'm calling about your social media posts regarding your daughter's treatment. I believe you've mischaracterized the events of that evening and caused significant damage to my reputation and the hospital's standing in the community. I would appreciate it if you would remove those posts and issue a correction. The audacity of it, the complete lack of awareness that he'd nearly killed a child through negligence, left me momentarily speechless. Then I found my voice and it was cold enough to frost glass. Dr. Vance, I documented exactly what happened in my daughter's case with medical precision. If you believe any of my statements were factually incorrect, please specify which ones and I'll review my notes. Otherwise, I have no intention of removing an accurate account of substandard care that nearly resulted in my daughter's death. If you're concerned about your reputation, perhaps you should focus on improving your clinical judgment rather than silencing the people you've harmed. He started to sputter a response about legal action and defamation, but I cut him off. I'm happy to discuss this further with your attorney present. Have them contact me directly. I hung up before he could respond, my hands shaking with rage and adrenaline. The state medical board moved faster than I expected, likely because of the public attention the case was receiving. An investigator called to schedule an interview about my complaint, and I spent 2 hours walking her through every detail of that night. She asked pointed questions about the hospital's triage protocols, Dr. Vance's assessment process, and the transformation in care after I'd revealed my credentials. She was particularly interested in Donna's statement that Zara didn't look that bad, asking me to explain from a medical perspective why visual assessment alone was inadequate for diagnosing the severity of anaphylaxis. I provided citations from peer-reviewed literature and clinical guidelines, building a case that was impossible to dismiss as subjective disagreement. Mercy Point's administration tried a different approach 2 weeks later, sending their chief medical officer, Dr. Leonard Huang, to meet with me personally. We met at a neutral location, a conference room at a hotel downtown, and he arrived with a lawyer who introduced herself as Jennifer Russo, hospital counsel. Dr. Huang was polished and apologetic, expressing sincere regret about my daughter's experience while carefully avoiding any admission that would constitute legal liability. He wanted to discuss how they could make this right, he said, perhaps offering some form of compensation for our distress. The lawyer sat quietly taking notes, her presence a reminder that this was a negotiation, not a genuine attempt at accountability. I let Dr. Huang finish his prepared remarks before responding. I appreciate you taking this seriously enough to meet with me, but I'm not interested in compensation that requires signing a non-disclosure agreement and allowing this to be buried. What I want is real systemic change. I want your ER staff retrained on recognizing and treating anaphylaxis. I want your triage protocols revised to eliminate the requirement for paperwork before treatment in genuine emergencies. I want Dr. Vance's credentials reviewed by the state board. And I want you to acknowledge publicly that my daughter received substandard care that endangered her life. The lawyer's pen stopped moving and she looked up sharply. Dr. Huang shifted uncomfortably in his chair. That's a significant request, Dr. Huang said carefully. Some of those changes would require board approval and substantial resources, and public acknowledgement of fault could expose the hospital to significant legal liability. Jennifer Russo nodded in agreement, already preparing to explain why they couldn't possibly meet my demands. I leaned forward and looked Dr. Huang directly in the eyes. Then let me be clear about what happens if you don't meet those requests. I continue using every platform available to me to ensure people know what kind of care they can expect at your hospital. The media attention continues. The medical board investigation continues. And every family who's been harmed by your staff's negligence is emboldened to come forward with their own stories. I have nothing to lose here because my daughter already almost lost everything. The meeting ended without resolution, both sides retreating to consider their positions. I knew I'd probably overplayed my hand, that hospitals had armies of lawyers and resources to bury complaints from single individuals, but I also knew they were terrified of the attention this was generating, of the potential cascade effect if other victims started filing formal complaints or lawsuits. The lawyer called 2 days later with a revised offer. The hospital would implement new training protocols and revise their triage system. They'd bring in an outside consultant to review their emergency department procedures. But they couldn't make public admissions of fault due to legal concerns, and they couldn't influence the medical board's independent investigation of Dr. Vance. Take it or leave it. I took it because it was more than most people got when fighting institutional negligence, and because the perfect was the enemy of the good. But I also continued pushing publicly for accountability, refusing to sign any non-disclosure agreement, continuing to share my story with anyone who asked. The local news ran a series on emergency department failures, using my case as the anchor, but expanding to examine systemic issues across multiple hospitals. Sophie Laurent, the nurse who'd apologized that first night, eventually agreed to be interviewed anonymously, describing a culture at Mercy Point where staff were encouraged to view certain patients as less deserving of immediate care based on subjective assessments of their credibility or worthiness. The broader impact took months to develop, but eventually created changes I'd never anticipated. The state legislature introduced a bill requiring all emergency departments to treat any patient presenting with symptoms of anaphylaxis within 15 minutes of arrival, regardless of paperwork completion. They called it Zara's Law, though I'd never sought that recognition. Medical schools began using my case in their curricula as an example of implicit bias in emergency medicine. Hospital administrators from across the region invited me to speak at their training sessions about patient advocacy and the dangers of assumption-based care. I became a reluctant activist, driven by the knowledge that my daughter had only survived because I'd had credentials to flash, and by the certainty that countless others lacked that privilege. Dr. Vance's medical license was suspended for 6 months, following the board's investigation, though he appealed and eventually got it reduced to 3 months with mandatory continuing education on emergency assessment protocols. It wasn't the permanent revocation I'd hoped for, but it sent a message that physicians couldn't ignore obvious medical emergencies without consequences. Donna Murphy, the triage nurse, received a formal reprimand in her personnel file and was required to complete additional training. The security guard was fired after it emerged he'd been involved in 3 other incidents, where he'd threatened to remove patients who were later found to have legitimate medical emergencies. Small victories that didn't feel particularly victorious, but represented more accountability than most cases achieved. The emotional toll of fighting this battle while working full-time and raising Zara was crushing. I started seeing a therapist to process the trauma of that night and the subsequent months of advocacy work. Zara needed therapy too, developing anxiety around eating at restaurants and a hypervigilance about any physical symptoms that might indicate an allergic reaction. I'd saved her life but couldn't protect her from the psychological scars of having trusted adults dismiss her suffering, of having experienced firsthand how fragile the medical safety net really was. We worked through it together, finding ways to reclaim normalcy while acknowledging that something had fundamentally changed in how we viewed the world. 6 months after the incident, I received an envelope in the mail from Mercy Point Hospital. Inside was a letter from their new chief quality officer, Dr. Nina Sato, inviting me to join their patient safety committee. They were specifically seeking input from physicians who'd experienced failures in their system, she wrote, acknowledging that true improvement required uncomfortable honesty about past mistakes. The irony of being recruited to fix the institution that had nearly killed my daughter wasn't lost on me. But I also saw an opportunity to make lasting change from inside the system rather than just criticizing from the outside. I accepted the position with the explicit understanding that I wouldn't be silenced or asked to soft-pedal my critiques. My first committee meeting was tense, attended by several administrators and physicians who'd been involved in the decision-making process that had led to my daughter's near-death experience. Dr. Huang attended, as did a chastened Dr. Vance who'd been required to participate as part of his license reinstatement conditions. I presented data I'd compiled on emergency department wait times, patient outcomes stratified by demographic factors, and the correlation between triage delays and adverse events. The numbers painted a damning picture of systemic failures that went far beyond one doctor's bad judgment on one bad night. We spent 3 hours in uncomfortable discussion about implicit biases, protocol failures, and the cultural factors that allowed staff to dismiss legitimate emergencies. The changes we implemented over the following year were comprehensive and specific. New triage protocols that required immediate assessment by a physician or advanced practice nurse for any patient presenting with respiratory distress, chest pain, or other potentially life-threatening symptoms, regardless of insurance status or ability to complete paperwork. Mandatory implicit bias training for all clinical and support staff, with particular focus on recognizing how assumptions about patient credibility influenced medical decision-making. A patient advocate position stationed in the ER to help navigate families through the system and escalate concerns when staff weren't responding appropriately. Body cameras for security personnel to document all patient interactions. These weren't perfect solutions, but they were concrete steps that made the system marginally safer. I continued working at Riverside General but took on additional responsibilities as a consultant for hospital quality improvement, using my experience at Mercy Point as a case study in what not to do. I spoke at medical conferences about the night my daughter nearly died, about the specific failures that had almost cost her life, about the broader systemic issues those failures represented. Some audiences were receptive, eager to learn how to prevent similar disasters. Others were defensive, viewing my critique as an attack on hardworking emergency physicians, rather than an attempt to identify fixable problems. The resistance reminded me why change in medicine happened so slowly, why institutions protected themselves rather than their patients. Zara is 13 now, 4 years past that terrible night. She carries 2 EpiPens everywhere and has learned to advocate for herself with the ferocity of someone who knows that other people's assumptions can be deadly. She wants to be a doctor when she grows up, she tells me, but specifically a doctor who listens to patients instead of making judgments based on how sick they look. I'm proud of her resilience and terrified for her idealism, knowing how hard the medical system works to beat that empathy out of young physicians. But I also hope that by the time she's practicing medicine, some of the changes we fought for will have made the system marginally better, marginally more likely to treat every patient like their life matters. The restaurant where Zara had her initial reaction was sued by 3 other families who'd suffered allergic reactions after being assured dishes were allergen-free. They'd been adding fish sauce to their supposedly vegetarian marinara for years, A shortcut that added depth of flavor while violating every standard of truth in menu labeling. They settled all the cases and revised their practices, though I never ate there again. Some violations of trust can't be remedied by legal judgments or policy changes. They require a complete severing of the relationship, an acknowledgement that restoration is impossible, and protection requires distance. And I think often about the patients who came before Zara and weren't lucky enough to have a mother with medical credentials and the knowledge to fight back. About the people who died or suffered permanent harm because emergency department staff made the same assumptions Dr. Vance made about my daughter, but whose families lacked the resources or expertise to hold the system accountable. About the implicit hierarchies that determined whose suffering was taken seriously and whose was dismissed based on factors that had nothing to do with medical need. The work of dismantling those hierarchies was far larger than one person's advocacy could accomplish, but I was determined to chip away at it wherever I could, for as long as it took. 4 years later, I still keep my hospital badge in my wallet, a talisman, and a reminder that credentials shouldn't determine who receives life-saving care, even though that night they saved my daughter's life when nothing else would have mattered to the people sworn to help her. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.